Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be continuing my series of reviews of the Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. And in this video, I'm actually going to be reviewing Spider-Man 2, which is one of my favorite superhero and comic book movies of all time. Now, as I said before with the original Spider-Man, which you could see a review of in the top right corner, I had some things that I really liked about it, and also some things I didn't like so much. And I break that down way more in depth. This is going to be continuing from that. Naturally, it's also going to be having spoilers that are going to be following up on that, and then during the video itself and review. But nonetheless, it is one of those movies that I thought definitely needed to live up to at the very least and surpass the original movie, because I was a big Spider-Man fan and there were certain things I didn't think it captured quite as well. However, in this movie, I ended up loving it when it initially came out and thinking it far surpassed most other comic book movies of the time and even for some time afterward. And with that being said, I was wondering going back into this one if that actually would still be the case, if I still really would love this movie, or maybe it simply didn't hold up with time. But overall, coming out of that movie and rewatching it, I would have to say that I still think it's a great comic book movie, still one of the best of all time, still holding up in many ways, and with other things with new eyes that I have today, well, I'll be discussing them in depth. But before I begin, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications. That way you can stay up to date with all my future videos. Additionally, make sure to leave a like, share this video out, share your own thoughts in the comments, and make sure to watch the entire video. That way you guys will be able to help this channel to continue to grow, be more promoted, and to go even further beyond for my Dragon Ball fans out there. With that being said, let's get into the review. So coming out in the year 2004, Spider-Man 2 ended up being a movie that once again helped to revolutionize live-action comic book films. The first one, along with the first X-Men, were already doing great things in terms of reinventing for a lot of people what a live-action comic book character and portrayal could be like. That, along with Blade and eventually X-Men 2, and some of the other movies coming out at the time, showed people that not only could you have really good, compelling stories with regard to a comic book character in live action, but also that they could be really profitable. And that's definitely the case for Spider-Man 2 with regard to it being one of the most successful sequels of the time and a movie that still continues to influence everything here today. And again, once again, Tobey Maguire returned for this movie as Peter Parker with his portrayal. Now, with regard to that, Tobey Maguire was actually injured with his back coming into this movie. And so as a result, there was a chance that they were actually going to replace Tobey. And, you know, that goes into some behind the scenes things you could see in different documentaries about how a lot of the time Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire didn't really get along when it came to filming the films. And as a result, he actually was one of the people, based on what I recall, who actually wanted to recast Tobey with Leonardo DiCaprio playing Spider-Man. However, Tobey ended up showing up on the filming, and they did some things to kind of write in the fact that he was injured. Like, for example, the scene where he falls from up top on the rooftops and injures his back, and he says, "Oh, my back," which ended up becoming a big meme. Now, in terms of the overall storyline, the film, with regard to Spider-Man, now it features very different struggles. This movie is definitely the ultimate down-on-your-luck underdog story in a sense, because literally everything that can go wrong goes wrong for Spider-Man in this movie. And you really feel for him, because not only is Tobey Maguire such an earnest portrayal of Spider-Man, as I mentioned in the previous video, with it being very similar to Christopher Reeve's portrayal of Superman in his own films with Richard Donner, the fact of the matter is that you see that he's struggling. He has like a low rent apartment with his landlord who's always saying, "Give me rent." Not only that, but his Aunt May is going through financial struggles where she's going to lose her home because of not paying her taxes. And then after that, there's also the fact that everything with Mary Jane is really going sideways. I'm going to get into that when I get into her character, because a lot of the things that people didn't like about the first movie, they really do not like in this movie with the second part with Mary Jane. And combine that with the fact that we have his best friend, who is Harry Osborn, who blames Spider-Man for the death of his father, and not just that, but knows that Peter Parker is the photographer who takes pictures of Spider-Man and will not reveal his identity to Harry. This leads to everything culminating with not only the issues with Harry, where it's being built up to where eventually he will become the Green Goblin or the Hobgoblin as he was supposed to be, but his suit and everything ends up being totally different than you would expect in the next movie, which I'll get into when we come time for that review. And this leads to a situation where Spider-Man loses his powers. He no longer is capable of actually being able to fight Spider-Man because of his mental block. And of course, during all of that, we have the fact that he also is not wanting to be Spider-Man anymore. He doesn't want to have to keep making the sacrifices required to be a truly great hero like Spider-Man, sacrificing Mary Jane, sacrificing his happiness, and thus in turn, we have a great scene where he and the actor who portrays Uncle Ben are sitting in a car in his imagination, which is also really similar to what happens in Batman v Superman on top of the mountain, and then also in Star Wars Rise of Skywalker, which wasn't as effective as this one either way. And with that being said, he says that he's not going to be Spider-Man anymore, throws his suit in the trash, which of course is based on the iconic Spider-Man story of Spider-Man No More, which I think this movie does a really great job of portraying in its own way. Now, as for the villain in this film, we have Dr. Otto Octavius, or Doc Ock, who is portrayed by Alfred Molina, who does a great job in this. In terms of the villains in the Spider-Man movies, for me, Doc Ock was actually always my favorite. I think that the way that they make this character extremely sympathetic, where he is introduced as this nice guy who has his wife, and then in turn he's trying to change the world in a positive way with his science, but then everything goes wrong. He loses his wife. He ends up basically being taken over by the AI in the independent arms that are on his back, which in turn caused him to become Doc Ock, but then he's trying to once again recreate the machine, either through a combination of the AI wanting to do that for their own purpose, or perhaps his own ego, or all of the above. And in turn, he proceeds to do terrible things like robbing banks, trying to kill people, trying to kill Spider-Man, and a bunch of other things, with eventually his end goal of trying to build this machine that creates essentially like an artificial sun ends up backfiring, and in turn leading to the almost destruction of everything. And this also leads into him teaming up with Harry, which in turn gets Spider-Man in a situation where he's able to reveal his secret identity, and then in turn finds out that he was actually Peter Parker. Now, considering just how easy Spider-Man was able to break free of the bonds that were around him, you kind of wonder why he didn't do that before Harry took off his mask. But either way, it served the purpose of having him, be revealed to his friend, which in turn caused the conflict within him, which inevitably he would decide upon the next movie when he tries to kill Spider-Man after becoming the Hobgoblin. But like I said, I'll get into that in the next review. We also have the return of J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, who does an amazing job in this movie.
You serious?
And actually, when I rewatched this movie, I rewatched the extended version of the film, I think for the first time. I think I've only really seen the theatrical version before. And whereas there are scenes that I feel like don't really fit in, you could see why they were cut in terms of pacing, in terms of placement of those scenes chronologically, there is an amazing scene with J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson dressed up as Spider-Man, which definitely makes the overall extended version worth watching just for that. But either way, he does an amazing job, and like I said before, he did such a great job, they didn't even try to recast him with the MCU version of the story. Also, the actress who plays Aunt May does a great job in this movie as well, and, continues to be one of those supporting extras. And that's one of the things about these movies, about what Sam Raimi does with them, that there are so many extras, there are so many side characters involved in the story that actually bring an extra sense of charm to everything we see during it, in which these characters, like, for example, the landlord, like his daughter, like the doctor that Spider-Man talks to when he's trying to, figure out what to do with regard to his powers. Sam Raimi does a great thing, kind of like the Coens do, in terms of making the world a lot more interesting and quirky by having these extras, or these characters who you'd think would get zero actual development whatsoever, having memorable scenes so that you could actually remember everything that happens. Like, for example, characters in Fargo, or in a movie like No Country for Old Men. You see all these random characters, or seemingly random, who actually play a bigger role in the film, and thus in turn that's something that Sam Raimi does in his own movies as well. Now, the biggest con for me in this movie, and many other fans, comes down to Mary Jane and her portrayal in this movie. Because the fact that Mary Jane, I didn't like the resolution, or really lack of one in a sense, in the first movie with regard to her relation with Peter. And that is because the fact that in the comics and the cartoons, Mary Jane and Peter, we know they're going to get together. They already do almost immediately in the story. They both kind of just click with each other in a lot of adaptations. And thus, in turn, we didn't really need to see a whole drawn-out drama where Peter doesn't want to be Mary Jane's boyfriend, because the fact that even though he clearly loves her and she clearly loves him and they want to be together, he is saying, no, I'm Spider-Man and I don't want to threaten her life by being her boyfriend. But then he still is her friend and is around her a good amount, going to visit her. So anyone who targets him would probably target Mary Jane, which is exactly what happens in this movie, because Peter, who has given up at being Spider-Man at this point, goes on basically a date with Mary Jane, and then Doc Ock throws a car through a window, which would have easily killed Peter and Mary Jane and everyone else in that bar if Peter wasn't Spider-Man and Doc Ock didn't know he was Spider-Man for some reason. So yeah, this movie definitely has scenes like that that don't make any sense along the way too, that are worth noting, because I'm sure everyone's thinking about it every time they rewatch this movie. But either way, Mary Jane isn't just kind of having a flirtation with Peter. During the exact same movie, she also is seeing J. Jonah Jameson's son, the astronaut, who in the comics is directly linked to Venom and everything that we actually see in the Venom movies later on, which I've actually reviewed. The first one, I believe, either on here or Laughingstock Media, which I will link in the top right corner. But Mary Jane is clearly just in a relationship with this guy to make Peter jealous. And we know that because the fact that there's a whole extended scene where she's talking to one of her girlfriends when she's getting shoes or something, or getting dressed and ready for, the upcoming ball that she's at. And she's like going in depth about, do you actually love this guy? And she's like, yeah, sure. But it's obvious she's just doing it to get back at Peter. She eventually accepts his proposal for marriage and literally goes all the way up to the marriage, getting in the dress, making the guy and the whole family and everyone get there. They probably had to fly out on planes. They probably had to put in a lot of expenses and everything to set up this wedding. And we already know that J.J. Jameson was putting together a recital because he tells them to cancel the caviar. And then in turn, what happens is she just runs away wearing the wedding dress that she might not have even paid for. And then in turn goes to see Peter, a different guy, and is like, no, we're going to be together, Peter. And so I could see why a lot of people hate Mary Jane in this movie and don't like the entire aspect with her, because the fact that, it's like the meme that people say from these movies now. Mary Jane is for the streets. The thing is that in the context of the movie, what they're trying to say is that Mary Jane and Peter are meant for each other. They're supposed to be together, and everything else is just getting in the way. And that either way, that's what ends up happening at the end of the movie. But again, her portrayal is very different from the Mary Jane in the comics, aside from Kirsten Dunst looking more or less like her. So that's probably the biggest con for me, is all the the relationship drama with her and Peter and Harry a little bit, not only in the first movie, but then in the next movie. And only really gets worse from here, surprisingly, because of something that happens in the next movie, which I never like at all, and I'm definitely going to talk in depth about. In terms of direction, Sam Raimi once again does a great job bringing more of his iconic style to the film, making everything a lot more horror-based, especially in the scene with Doc Ock, where he is being operated on by the surgeons, and then he like kills everyone in the room, and he has the whole no scene, you know? So there's a lot more of the horror elements that Sam Raimi brings here, and you could definitely see way more of his Sam Raimi-isms on display versus in the first movie where he was a lot more controlled. Other than that, we also have the great iconic score from Danny Elfman, which ends up being even better in this movie than it was in the first one, and with him going even further beyond in terms of the overall quality that he brought to everything. Also, in terms of a score, this movie, Spider-Man 2, currently has a 7.5 on IMDb, whereas the first movie has a 7.4, but honestly, I think that both movies probably could be rated higher. Like I said in the last one, 7.5 at least for the original Spider-Man. I would give this movie at least an 8 because to me, it still is a great movie that holds up in a lot of ways. And while it may have some negative aspects to it, especially with regard to what I mentioned prior, overall, still I think it's a great movie and one of the best comic book movies of all time. And that's saying something because it has been almost 20 years since it originally released. All right, guys, so this has been my review of Spider-Man 2. Make sure to stay tuned for my review of Spider-Man 3 coming out soon on the channel. Make sure to subscribe, enable all notifications, and stick around because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.